Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Shannon Powell of Indivisible Westchester. The end of 2022 brings the end of the 117th Congress. That brings an end to the term of Mondaire Jones, the congressman from New York's 17th District. Congressman Jones is joining us tonight for a year-end town hall to reflect on his term in Congress and to answer your questions. First, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, all of the groups who are co-sponsoring this event. If you have a question for the congressman, please put it in the chat and we will try to get to as many of your questions as we can. This year, redistricting changed the contours of the 17th district, and another incumbent Democrat, Sean Patrick Maloney, chose to run in the 17th. Mondaire ran in the 10th congressional district and lost the primary there to Dan Goldman. But despite all of this, Congressman Jones has continued to work hard for his constituents right here at home. Mondaire, first of all, thank you so much for your service. It was an eventful 2 years to spend in Congress. I'm sure there were a lot of ups and downs. What accomplishments are you most proud of?
I appreciate that opportunity. And if you don't mind, I'll start by saying a few words before we get into Q&A, Shannon. And sure. I want to thank Mark and Bruce for also putting this together and all of the participating organizations. I see so many familiar faces, and I'm in DC right now because of votes and the signing of the Respect for Marriage Act, but just know that my heart is with you and that I think about you every single day. Not only the work that you do within your organizations, but your help, so many of you, in getting me to this place. I just could not have made it this far without you. And that means that Democrats in Congress and that our president could not have had this level of success without your activism and without your support. Shortly before beginning this town hall, I was about to tweet, we are the most productive Congress in modern history, period. And I mean that sincerely. Sometimes politicians will exaggerate the nature of their work and their accomplishments. But I was just at the White House a few hours ago for the signing, as I mentioned, of the Respect for Marriage Act, which is my bill with Jerry Nadler that will require the federal government and other states, for that matter, to recognize same-sex and interracial marriages. This is a moment I never could have imagined for this country growing up closeted, not having any gay role models and thinking that I would never come out. And yet somehow when you look at these past 2 years in their totality in American politics, it's not clear to me that the Respect for Marriage Act will even rank in the top 5 list of achievements under this president and this Democratic Congress. When I first got to Congress, it was a time of great uncertainty for many of us here in the Hudson Valley. It was at the height of the pandemic. And it was at a time when our essential workers were stretched thin. Our children were dealing with virtual learning and social isolation, and working families were struggling just to put food on the table. I knew I had my work cut out for me in Washington. I knew that I had to deliver for the community that raised me and for hundreds of millions of Americans across the country who were struggling too. My Democratic colleagues and I worked tirelessly to build bridges, to bring people together and to deliver real results when it mattered the most. So under the American Rescue Plan Act, we funded a national testing and vaccination strategy that simply did not exist under the previous president. Many of you will recall that the other guy told us to drink bleach. We expanded the child tax credit, which cut child poverty nearly in half in this country, which has helped so many more families get the relief and the support that they needed. And now we're still fighting to make the child tax credit permanent. And we may have an opportunity in the omnibus appropriations bill that we are still negotiating and that we are expected to pass next week. I'm really excited about the possibility of getting this done next week. I was proud to bring home hundreds of millions of dollars for New York's 17th district as part of the American Rescue Plan. Many of you will recall $73 million in New York's 17th district for community health centers, including Open Door and Sun River Health in Westchester, $240 million for our public schools in New York 17th, and over $60 million for neighborhood small businesses. But the American Rescue Plan was just the beginning of the kind of results and the kind of leadership that Democrats have been delivering. As the youngest member of House leadership, I was proud to play a key role in bringing progressive and conservative Democrats together to pass the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is the largest investment in our nation's infrastructure in generations. This is a law that's going to restore roads, bridges, and water management systems, expand broadband access in rural areas, restore and expand public transit, build hundreds of thousands of electric vehicle charging stations across the country, create good paying green jobs, and invest in climate resilience for our public infrastructure. And then you know that we followed up in August of this year by passing the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a law that's going to lower prescription drug costs for Medicare recipients like my grandmother, who had to work well past the age of retirement just to pay for the high cost of prescription drugs. It's going to expand healthcare coverage. It's going to lower energy costs. It's going to reduce the effects of climate change. And it's going to create millions of good paying union jobs over the next decade, because we're finally going to allow Medicare to negotiate the cost of prescription drugs. And we're going to cap the cost of out-of-pocket drugs, the out-of-pocket cost for drugs at $2,000 annually for Medicare recipients, beginning in the year 2025. And in January of this upcoming year, if you're on Medicare and you have insulin, it's going to be no more than $35 per month. This is a really big deal. The Inflation Reduction Act is also going to reduce our carbon emissions by 40% by the year 2030, and it's going to lower energy costs through building electric vehicle charging stations, strengthening our manufacturing here domestically, and offering a mix of tax credits and rebates for renewable energy. So I'm really proud of this and so much more that we've done. I realize that redistricting, through no fault of the people on this Zoom tonight, was a complete nightmare. It was a nightmare for my constituents in the same way that it was a nightmare for me personally. I've got a lot of feelings about it, as you might imagine, but I also remain optimistic about the future of this country. There's much more work to be done, and in whatever capacity I can continue to be helpful, whether it is joining you in your organizations or running for office at some point in the near future, I want to be helpful, because my passion is improving the lives of other people. And I think I've established that I've been really good at that these past 2 years. And again, I'm just honored to be with you tonight. And Shannon, if you can re-ask me that question, I'm happy to answer it.
No, I think you covered a lot of it. I mean, the accomplishments, I mean, the question was, what accomplishments are you most proud of? The litany of things that you just mentioned, I mean, it's really overwhelming. It's mind blowing, to be honest with you. And it's certainly something you should be very proud of, and that we're proud of as well.
Thank you. You know, I saw the way the infrastructure package was being negotiated and all the drama surrounding it. You'll remember that there was a time when folks didn't think we would get either that or Build Back Better passed through the House. And I'm proud, and as I think about one of my proudest achievements of having brought members of our caucus together and negotiate an agreement that got passage of the infrastructure bill, and at least through the House, which was the subject of contention at the time, we got Build Back Better through as well. We ended up passing some version of that in the form of the Inflation Reduction Act, which contains many of the climate provisions and the prescription drug reform provisions that were in Build Back Better. But of course, we still need to go further. There's housing, there's childcare, there's so much that was left on the floor, unfortunately, because of ultimately Joe Manchin and unanimous Republican opposition.
So Hakeem Jeffries is the new leader of the Democratic caucus. What do you think his first priority should be, and what do you think his biggest challenge will be?
You know, in some ways, he's got an easier job than he would have as Speaker of an ideologically diverse caucus where everyone has strong opinions about everything. In the minority, it's easier for folks to be on message. One of the great travesties in American politics will be that for the next 2 years, people who are not just unserious policymakers, but who are hostile to the idea of government itself, and who have significantly embraced white nationalism and white supremacy in the form of anti-Semitism and overt racism, and to say nothing of xenophobia and the transphobia and the homophobia that we've seen, not just from Marjorie Taylor Greene, but from the standard bearer of the Republican Party himself, who announced his presidential campaign essentially by dining with Nick Fuentes and Kanye West. I read an article in Newsweek that described how George Santos out on Long Island was at a convening of a gala sponsored by the New York Young Republican Club that had a series of far right Nazi
Mhm.
affiliated individuals. And I think it speaks to where the party is on the Republican side, and that's a really scary thing. And I'm hopeful that Americans will be dissatisfied enough to return us to control of Congress in 2024.
So I want to talk actually about that meeting with the New York Young Republicans Club this past weekend that George Santos, who just won a House seat in Long Island, was at, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump Jr. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. In fact, we even found out that Roger Stone was in Westchester for some kind of rally over the weekend. You know, these extremists are the face of the modern GOP, including here in New York. What do we do about it? I think that's one of the things that we struggle with, especially as activists. You know, we feel like there's something we should be doing, but what do you suggest it should be?
I think as activists, it's making sure that this does not become normal. And it is the case that that gala that George Santos attended still hasn't gotten as much attention as it ought to. And I think it's because there's so much else that happened. You know, a discussion about the attendees of that event quickly was dwarfed by Marjorie Taylor Greene's, I don't know if it was a keynote or not, perhaps worse if it wasn't, in which she mentioned that if she and Steve Bannon had indeed planned the January 6th insurrection, it would have been a successful insurrection and it would have been armed, which it was, by the way. And so I think there are a lot of things going on. I think the media doesn't have the kind of attention span that it should. I think the American people get their news from the media, you know, for understandable reasons, you know, can't keep track. And so it's really incumbent, I think, where the media fails on activists to educate people about who their members of Congress are and what's going on and keeping, you know, basically keeping an inventory of everything that's been going on, because people, I think, are still surprised to hear some of this stuff. And I thought it was significant that the person who's going to be representing New York's 17th district, you know, after I mentioned on Twitter that like there was no condemnation of anti-Semitism from him, you know, didn't even criticize Donald Trump, but just said generally that there's no place for anti-Semitism in the Republican Party, which we know, by the way, to be false, because like so many of the top leaders of the Republican Party are embracing anti-Semitism. But when you can't even criticize Donald Trump, it shows you where we are as a society in our politics.
So I want to also follow up with a question about Michael Lawler, who, you know, is going to sadly hold this seat, who is a Trump Republican. I mean, how do we hold him accountable then for these things that he fails to speak out about, or the things that he does, or the votes he's going to take? What do we do there with him?
I think the most devastating thing he'll do is vote for a Republican Speaker of the House who is going to be beholden to Marjorie Taylor Greene and Jim Jordan and potentially Matt Gaetz and others. There will be investigations like nothing we have seen before, unfortunately, and you can't disassociate yourself from that if you voted for a speaker who's going to allow that to happen. And so I think it's that. I think it's keeping track of the way people are voting in Congress, and whether they're willing to condemn the most extreme behavior, the most ultra MAGA behavior that we are going to see, not just from some of the names we're familiar with, but from a whole slew of new members and other members who will be emboldened once in the majority to say things that they might not have said because they were still trying to take back the majority at that time over these past 2 years.
Right. I just want to remind everybody, if you have a question for Representative Jones, put it in the chat and we'll try and get to your questions once we finish this portion of the town hall. So kind of expanding on that, because Republicans are going to be in the majority, what challenges do we face with the GOP-led House? I mean, you mentioned some of them, but what else do you see on the horizon, and what do Democrats, need to do in response?
Well, remember that while all of this is happening, states throughout this country continue to disenfranchise and otherwise make it extremely difficult for communities of color to exercise their constitutional right to vote. We saw an unsuccessful attempt in the state of Georgia to get rid of Saturday early voting. Mm-hmm. And by the grace of God, that was rejected by every state court at every level in Georgia to consider it, but that was not a foregone conclusion. Mm-hmm. And so I say this to say we won't be able to pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act or the Freedom to Vote Act or any kind of voting rights or democracy reform, including campaign finance and partisan gerrymandering reform legislation over these next 2 years. And so that's going to be at a major cost to our democracy. It means that in 2024, we will hardly have a functioning Voting Rights Act. In fact, by the end of next year, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is really what remains of it right now, may be obliterated in an Alabama case called Merrill v. Milligan. And so, I think we should prepare in 2024 for an even tougher fight than 2020 was. And it's going to be incumbent upon us to educate people about how to navigate some of these esoteric rules in different states. It won't surprise organizations represented on this Zoom tonight to know that New York is not nearly as far along as it should be on the question of voting rights. I was speaking to Abigail Spanberger out of Virginia yesterday, and she was saying that they've got 45 days of early voting in Virginia. And that's, many other states have more than 10 days of early voting.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I grew up in Tennessee, and when I was home in October, it was early voting. This was weeks before we had early voting. So yeah, we have made strides here in New York, but there's still a long ways to go before we change all these state laws. I believe we were 48th in the nation when it came to voting. And these are things we learned as activists. So that's why, again, pushing for all these reforms. I appreciate, you mentioning that, because we can continue to make progress, even at the state level, regarding strengthening these laws. So it was a brutal year. You talked a little bit about this for New York Democrats running for Congress. We lost several seats. What do you think Democrats here need to do in order to win back the seats that they lost?
So organize and organize year round. Get people registered to vote who aren't. Get people engaged. Let them know what their elected officials are not doing, if these are people who need to be replaced, so that when it comes time, people are not surprised to start hearing messages for the first time about the failings of their elected representatives. There is just no reason why any of these seats should have gone Republican this cycle. If my colleagues in far more competitive districts in places like Pennsylvania and in Orange County, California, and in Virginia and elsewhere could keep their seats, there is no good reason why we should be losing seats, certainly not in New York's 17th district, which Biden carried by 10 points, and not in the Catco district, which I think is New York 22, and not in Long Island as well. Those seats were held by Kathleen Rice and Tom Suozzi. We know Democrats can win these seats. So I think, making sure that we are organizing and educating people about who these people are, who have won these seats, as well as running good candidates who know the districts well and who are going to be present in the districts and do the work of campaigning instead of taking people's votes for granted. I I have said publicly that we need new party leadership at the state level. I do think that that's not the only solution. There's a lot else that we need, but I think it's one of these several things. By what metric are we keeping people in leadership when we've lost all these seats, and as a result, the House, when resources are not being deployed in key parts of the state, and when people appear to be more interested in feuding with progressives long before this election happened, by the way, than they are with taking on Republicans. This is a big tent, and I think it's really important to welcome everybody in the party within it and to create space for those people. And of course, that means, not doing the same thing in the Hudson Valley that you would do in Brooklyn or Queens, but I have been really disappointed by what at times has been, I think, an impulse from people who are in leadership in the party to isolate and marginalize, particularly younger people, I think, who tend to describe themselves as more progressive in the party, instead of bringing them in and giving them leadership roles and learning from them. And I think we would be a more functional party in that case too.
I agree. I think that adopting the organizing model is so important in building out the party and expanding the resources that we have and making the investment and making, in doing that. I want to talk a little bit about democracy, because in the past, you've talked a lot about the threats to our democracy. What right now do you think is the biggest threat that we face to our democracy?
I think the biggest threat, and there are many, I'm going to list maybe two or three. Okay. We've got this new phenomenon of election subversion, where people are saying they're not going to even certify elections whose outcomes they disagree with. That was not on my bingo card 2 years ago. It just wasn't. I thought the voter disenfranchisement was problematic enough. We still have that. In these close races in Arizona and in Georgia, any tinkering that you do with early voting or with voting by mail, requiring witnesses and extra certifications, and you have to sign your signature a certain way, and you have to have an ID. All of those things, compounded, can really reverse the outcome of an election. And it has nothing to do with the security of the election or the fairness of the election. It has everything to do with making it difficult for people who will not be voting for Republicans to vote. So the voter disenfranchisement continues to be an issue, and it's only going to get worse, because I believe that the Supreme Court will strike another blow to Section 2 and basically dismantle what remains of the Voting Rights Act.
And explain to me what Section 2 is, because you referenced it earlier. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, just to let everybody know who are.
So Section 5, as you know, or as many of you know, was a coverage formula. So it was that, around the time of 1965, and this has been updated since then, there were certain states that had such an egregious history of discrimination that they had to either go to a panel of judges or the Department of Justice to get approval before they made changes to their voting laws. The Supreme Court struck that coverage formula down in 2013. Shelby v. Holder, Justice Roberts said it was outdated. But Section 2 had remained intact. And Section 2 is about, making changes to laws that have a discriminatory impact on racial and linguistic minorities. But despite the fact that Congress has clarified the meaning of Section 2 in the past, including in the early 1980s, the Supreme Court just in July 1st of 2021 in Brnovich v. DNC, or I forgot what the exact name of the type, but it was a decision out of Arizona, continue to make it difficult to prove a case of discriminatory impact, in defiance of what Congress had clearly clarified in the early 1980s. So I think this case coming out of Alabama is not going to go well for the Voting Rights Act. And so, what we'll have is state laws that, hopefully are progressive, but are really not, I think, in places like Georgia and Arizona and Texas and Florida and Wisconsin. And if the Supreme Court decides another case called Moore v. Harper, which is the independent state legislature doctrine a certain way, the legislature can do whatever it wants, and state courts won't even have the ability to review the decisions of the legislature when it comes to the elections context, which is really scary.
It's terrifying. I want to pivot a little bit to some of the questions from the audience. Mel Tansman wants to know what your ideas are for campaign finance reform.
So I think that dark money is a really bad thing. It's the third thing I would have mentioned in response to your question about the threats to our democracy. We saw that despite how well candidates were doing in races and in Senate races in particular, but also other races, that super PACs were just coming in and dwarfing them anyway. Kevin McCarthy has a Congressional Leadership Fund, which is a super PAC. Mitch McConnell has his own super PAC. And when it's a super PAC, you can donate unlimited sums to it, right? So like Peter, and the Republicans just have more billionaires than the Democrats do. So it's nothing for Peter Thiel to just give tens of millions of dollars to a super PAC, and all of a sudden the money that like Mandela Barnes had raised, or Tim Ryan, or John Fetterman, an individual that has limits to it because you can only give a certain amount in direct contributions, just gets dwarfed because you get these independent expenditures by through these super PACs. And I say dark money is because you don't have to disclose the source of a lot of this money. I think we see Sam Bankman-Fried having done that according to the indictment that was unsealed today on both the Democratic and Republican side. And I'm looking forward to seeing who gets caught up in that because it's just really damaging. It's really damaging for our democracy.
Margaret Brown. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Disclosure requirements, and we also need a matching system. The Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act has a 6-to-1 matching system. If I give you $50, that becomes $350. And all of a sudden, working class people, more women, more people of color have a fighting chance at winning in congressional races, because even though they don't come from money or from moneyed networks, their grassroots donors get amplified in that process.
So leveling the playing field is really important. Margaret Bradbury wants to know what the best way to get the ECA through it and signed would be.
I think it may happen next week. I think it may happen. I am not very involved in those conversations. In fact, I'm not involved in those conversations. I've gotten some updates. I saw Chuck Schumer's statement today. I did meet with the speaker and the rest of House leadership yesterday to talk about this. And I think right now, the Senate has its own version, which is not viewed to be like, for example, in the Senate, the version in the Senate has a lower threshold for objecting to electors, right? We want to make it more difficult for people to object. And so they would have a lower threshold for the number of people who would have to object. It may be, I don't want to undercut negotiations. So that's kind of the, I think that's one of the sticking points right now.
Gotcha. Deb Porter wants to know what you attribute New York's congressional seat losses to. And John Nona also wants to just expand on that a little bit. If you think we lost seats because of failure of party leadership, failure of messaging, or addressing alleged crime and inflation issues.
It's a lot of what was just described. Let's start with what we all tried to do in getting people registered under the census. We wanted people to get their census completed. The legislature allocated $20 million to do census outreach. Governor Cuomo delayed the disbursement of that $20 million. Speak to people in the legislature, they will tell you this. It's also been written about in the Times Union did an article about it at the time. And so when you look at the fact that we only lost a congressional seat by 89 people, you can point to any number of things that were the direct cause of that. I think what I just described being one of the more clear-cut examples of something that would have made a difference. I think the failure of the state legislature to get behind its own ballot initiative to make it easier for the Independent Redistricting Commission to reach consensus. I actually had very few problems with the maps that were drawn by the Independent Redistricting Commission when it came down to it. But, you know, separate and apart from that, there was the fact that it would have been easier for people on that commission to reach consensus. And then a clearly gerrymandered map was enacted that the Court of Appeals struck down. So you could quibble with the person who appointed those judges, or you could quibble with the people who, you know, didn't have any modesty, I think, when they drew maps like what New York 17 was, which went all the way into Sullivan County. I mean, come on. Or the Jerry Nadler district, but given the way that was drawn. There has to be, so, and then, look, I think we have to take this issue of crime head on, but we can't be reactionary about it as well, right? So what I've said repeatedly, as someone who supports making sure that our police departments have the resources that they need, is that people deserve to feel and to actually be safe. And I'm very proud to have supported all 6 of the police funding bills for our small police departments. There was an article in the New York Times the other day. Our police officers are being underpaid in New York City in particular. But also, it's incumbent upon us to push back on this narrative that somehow Westchester and Rockland and Putnam are unsafe in Nassau County, for example, because guess what? The U.S. News and World Report, you know, just did a report showing that Nassau was literally the safest county. It was ranked number one as the safest county in the entire country. Rockland was number 3. Westchester was number 4. George Latimer's administration published a report showing a decline in crime over the past few years. And I know that Indivisible has been one of the organizations that has amplified that information on social media. Putnam was ranked number 12, so not too far behind, as one of the safest counties in the entire country. And so we can push back on this narrative that the Hudson Valley is this massive crime zone, while also making sure that, you know, we're not using inflammatory language and are recognizing that people are feeling unsafe and that some categories of crime have gone up. And you know, and so I think just like making sure that we do both of those things, which I think is possible, and is the ethical approach to take here, I think is important.
A couple of participants have questions about young voters and how best to appeal to them.
So I think we saw Gen Z turnout in a really significant way this year. I think student debt cancellation was a big part of that. I think the Inflation Reduction Act was a big part of that. I think, as with all other demographics, probably the most important thing was an unfortunate decision from the Supreme Court in the Dobbs opinion that took away the fundamental right to an abortion. And, you know, in some ways, I don't want to pat ourselves on the back too much, because I know that more than anything, that contributed to the turnout that we saw and our defiance of the historic trends that we would see in the midterm election. And so I think we've got to redouble our efforts. And, you know, as we go into 2024, for example, making sure, and by the way, there are elections in 2023. So I don't want to skip over that, but just making sure that we're talking about issues that matter to young people: climate, racial justice, you know, economic issues continue to, I think, be worse for this generation, for millennials and Gen Z, than they were for our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation. And inflation has only made that worse, actually.
A couple of also comments from Kate Permute and Ruth Walter about the Black maternal omnibus bill and if it will be part of the year-end spending bill. Do you know?
I love Kate is so consistent on this question. I appreciate. I
Good
appreciate
for her.
Oh, like I think some aspects of the omnibus were included in prior bills that we passed, but unfortunately, the bulk of what was in um, the which is called like the mom's bill. People have different names for it. Has not yet been included. I'll check in with Lauren Underwood to see what the prospects are for their inclusion in the omnibus bill that will pass. Hopefully, that will pass next week. It's not a foregone conclusion that we'll pass this omnibus bill next week, but I hope that we will.
Yes. Also from John Nona, wanting to know a little bit more about the legislation you worked on to reform the Supreme Court, to expand it, and also any comments about term limits.
Yeah. So many of you are familiar with my court expansion bill called the Judiciary Act, which is a bill that would add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. We had a poll that was done a few months ago showing that that position now enjoys the support of the majority of Americans. And so, unsurprisingly, I knew that it would take, unfortunately, some decisions like Dobbs to get us to this point where there is that kind of public support. And I think public support will only grow when we see the court continue to take away rights like marriage equality and potentially contraception if you take seriously Justice Thomas's concurring opinion in Dobbs, which you should when people tell you what they're going to do. And so, there's also other reforms, though. You mentioned term limits. I'm still not sold on term limits personally. They would have no retroactive effect. I don't think people like Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson are the problem on the court right now, or anyone who President Biden will appoint, frankly. I view that to be a rebalancing of the devastation that has been wrought by people like Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump and their enablers. I also want to just focus on ethics reform, which is in the form of a bill called the CERT Act. There is no binding code of ethics at the court. There is no mechanism for enforcing the recusal statute that does exist, but that Justice Thomas has violated repeatedly by continuing to opine in matters concerning January 6th. And that's really devastating because it undercuts the public perception of the court, which is a lot of the power that the court has is the way people view it, and the willingness of people to respect its decisions.
Mm-hmm. Right. It lacks a watchdog mechanism, basically. What was the biggest lesson you learned during your 2 years as a congressman?
I think the biggest lesson that I've learned as a freshman member of Congress is that if you are sufficiently hardworking and visionary and talented, that you can be as effective as any of your colleagues who have been serving for a longer period of time.
So Celeste Thies has a question. She wants to thank you for signing on to the letter to put a stop to the ACO REACH program, which is a plan to privatize Medicare. Any update on that?
So I think that has been defeated, but I want to check in. Look, I'll tell you this. Under Democratic control of Congress, there will be no privatization of Medicare, and there will be no privatization of Social Security. That is a commitment I can make. I do worry about what happens if we don't raise the debt ceiling this year, and specifically how Republicans controlling the House in 2023 will use that to exact concessions on Medicare and Social Security.
So Marcia Stone wants to say congrats on your appointment to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Tell us a little bit about that.
So thank you. I almost did my undergraduate thesis on the Civil Rights Commission, so it's surreal to now be appointed to the commission, and I'm really grateful to the speaker for appointing me to the commission. It's a 6-year term, but it does not prevent me from running for office or pretty much doing anything else, which I'm grateful for. And the job of the commission is to investigate and to report on the state of civil rights in this country. And I think over the next 2 years, the role of the commission is even more important because we won't be able to pass voting rights legislation. And we won't be able to pass the Equality Act, for example, which would enshrine in federal anti-discrimination law protections for the LGBTQ community. We won't be able to, unfortunately, codify the right to an abortion in these next 2 years because of Republican control of the House. And so it's even more important that agencies like the commission are able to sort of really surface what's going on in this country and the different states, and hopefully get that amplified by grassroots organizations and by the press.
So Ben Brown, a former UAW member, wants to know your thoughts about the pros and cons of railroad workers striking or denying their ability to strike.
So I'm really upset about the way that the administration approached this. I think that paid sick leave should have always been something that was part of the final deal when it came to our railroad workers. What happened was balanced against the billions and billions of dollars and I think just really life disrupting impact for all of America of not implementing that deal. And it's why I voted for legislation that would add paid sick leave. Unfortunately, the Senate didn't adopt that. And so what we got was something that was negotiated by Marty Walsh, the Secretary of Labor, and that was agreed to by only 8 of the 12 unions who were represented in that discussion.
So obviously with the GOP-led House, there are going to be lots of investigations as opposed to legislation that actually helps Americans. Do you think, though, that investigations like those into Hunter Biden's laptop and other ridiculous topics, do you think that's going to hurt or help Republicans in the end?
I think it's going to hurt Republicans. They ran on inflation and crime and what they described as the crisis at the border, but mostly it was inflation that they ran on. And if you're not bringing down costs for the American people, but instead are immediately going to do high profile hearings on the president's son and his romantic life, and impeach probably the Secretary of Homeland Security, then it's going to become clear to people that Republicans were not serious.
Have they ever been serious? Not lately.
Not lately.
No, I guess there are a few. Anyway, you would know best, Congressman. Deb Porter wants to know the best way for activists to get their message out between elections.
Making sure that you're talking to people on the street, that you're sending postcards. I think those are effective. That you're sending text messages and making phone calls, that you're educating them on what's happening in Congress. Again, so that people are not only hearing these messages for the first time a few weeks before Election Day, that they will know going into this season how important it is that they vote, because they'll know who their representative is and what they have and have not been doing. And I think also making sure that we're using all kinds of tools. So I mentioned postcards and texting and speaking to people on the street. But social media, I know many of you are active on social media, I think is very important as well. I don't know what's going to happen with Twitter over these next few months, whether Twitter will continue to even exist. But that's one of several ways where people get their information and amplify it.
Alvina McHale wants to know, if Republicans shut down the government, will the increase in Social Security payment and in Medicare premiums be put on hold?
I don't know the answer to that, so I'm gonna have to get back to you on that.
Okay. Obviously, many comments thanking you for your service. Many comments asking the big question of the night: what's next for you? And are you going to run in 2 years, or for the 2024 election?
Well,
You'd have to start running early. You know that.
I would love. Thank you, and I really do appreciate the affirmation, because it's been a really rough year, and you do wonder sometimes whether people saw how terribly I was treated, and that it wasn't a decision to no longer represent the people who I love so much, and have been delivering for. And so I guess what I would say is, I want to continue to hear from people about what they think I should do. And it's certainly not something I've ruled out. It's something I'm thinking about. But I have not made any decisions yet.
Do you have any ideas about what it's going to take? Because the district is different this time around. What it's going to take for a Democrat, whether it's you, which obviously most of us on this call would love to see, but for whoever decides to run and to challenge Lawler, what is it going to take to win that seat back?
I think it's going to take a lot of money. I think it's going to take knowing the district and being present in the district, and understanding that Westchester is different from Rockland, and from Putnam, and from Dutchess. And I think, having a story about why it is that you should be the member of Congress for the district. And I think that narrative is extremely important. The case for why. And, Lawler, I disagree with his case, but he had a case that resonated in Rockland, unfortunately. And the person he was running against didn't. And so, I think that's all going to be very important. And I think perhaps most important, having the support of the activist community in the district. You can't look, the DCCC is not going to win New York 17 back in 2024. The money will be helpful. The independent expenditures will be helpful. But it's going to be people knocking doors, sending personalized, postcards, doing, frankly, all of the things that you did to help me win my primary and my general election back in 2020. And because seeing something on television is different from knowing someone who's vouching for a candidate and who's, being relentless and telling you to make sure you vote and bring other people to vote with you. Organize.
What is the best way for people to reach you once you leave office?
So I'm going to continue to have a few different email accounts, info@mondaireforcongress.com.
Okay. People are going to like that, that email address. Don't tease us, Mondaire. Come on.
Don't read into that. I've had it this long, and so I figured I would keep the email address.
Right. Yeah, right. Good answer. Okay. As we're reaching the end of our town hall, we want to have a little bit of fun. Okay. So I'm going to put you on the spot. So now that you've worked with some of these people, we want you to describe each of these people in one word.
Okay.
Okay. You ready? Okay. And you can think about this as long as you want. Nancy Pelosi.
Effective.
Kevin McCarthy.
It's hard to do this. It's hard to do this in one word. It's hard.
You need a bleep function for this.
Unimpressive.
Oh, that's generous, Congressman. Hakeem Jeffries.
Strategic.
Hmm. Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Dangerous.
Hmm. Adam Schiff.
Champion.
Hmm. Liz Cheney.
Brave.
Hmm. Jamie Raskin.
Hero.
Matt Gaetz. I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I apologize.
Criminal.
Hmm. Now you maybe haven't worked with this person, the last two people, but you know, use your imagination. Clarence Thomas.
Sad.
Hmm. And to round it off, John Roberts.
Irresponsible.
Mondaire Jones. Run.
Ready.
Any final thoughts you have, Congressman?
I just look, I know this was on relatively short notice, and I'm so grateful that 90 plus people joined, and just know that it has been the honor of my life to represent you. I'm so excited about continuing to live in the district and making sure that I'm as supportive as I possibly can be as you need me these next 2 years. And so please don't hesitate to reach out. I want to see you. I want to do whatever I can to make sure that Democrats get elected and that we take back the House. That we take back the House in 2024. Our democracy depends on it. Our future depends on it, and our children's future depends on it. And I hope you see, and I know it's been really difficult at times these past 2 years, but now that we're nearing the end of this term, I hope you see that it really does make a difference when Democrats are in control. We have really done great things, and there's a lot left to do. You know, some of the things include voting rights, housing, childcare. These are things, you know, protecting Social Security and Medicare and expanding coverage. These are the things that we still need to do in 2025, and we hopefully take back the House.
Right. I mean, you have, again, thank you for working so hard. You've accomplished so much. This Congress has been phenomenal, as you mentioned before. But yes, the next 2 years are going to be challenging, and we have many those challenges ahead of us. So we need to organize, and don't stop. I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Congressman, for joining us tonight. Thanks again for your service. And you know, we're all going to be on the lookout for what you do next.
Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the night, and happy holidays.
Yes, everyone have a wonderful night and have a joyful holiday season. Thank you so much.